For our final set of videos, we're going to be considering Christianity as it develops in the late 20th century. So for the first part, we're going to consider Christianity in the United States through the lens of the civil rights movement that begins in the 50s and extends up through the 1970s and is even felt in significant ways today. A first point of departure for thinking about the civil rights movement is to think about the reality of continuing discrimination against African Americans in the mid-20th century. The first part of the 20th century saw a resurgence of what we know as Jim Crow laws, that is, intentionally discriminatory laws meant to disenfranchise African Americans from being full citizens of the United States. This was a limitation on voting rights, a limitation on access to education, limitation on access to other goods held publicly. African Americans are essentially relegated to a second-tier status, certainly in the American South, but discriminatory laws are on the books virtually in every state in the country. And these discriminatory laws can then also extend to other groups deemed as not white. Mexican Americans, Asian immigrants can also fall prey to these discriminatory laws. It's important to name how in the mid-20th century these discriminations continue. Southern Democratic lawmakers, when the New Deal legislation is being developed under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in order to get that legislation through Congress, Roosevelt has to agree with Southern Democratic lawmakers that African Americans would be explicitly banned from the benefits of federal programs. This is why maids and farm workers are excluded from getting Social Security benefits even up to this day. This is discriminatory legislation essentially aimed at those who were employed in those fields who tended to be Black and Latino. When the GI Bill is passed to help assist returning service members from World War II, the GI Bill is administered, the funds were permitted to be administered on the state level, so that state administration meant that largely Black veterans were denied the educational benefits that returning white service members received. So while white folks are able to go to college virtually free, the same is not afforded to African Americans. Similarly, housing laws that were designed to benefit returning veterans are also applied locally, and this led to lending discrimination. The combination of these two things, a lack of access to developing equity in housing and earning capacity through higher education, meant that a significant wealth gap developed between white Americans and Black Americans. An example of this is in 2016, where the average household wealth of a white family is $132,000, whereas in 2016, the average household wealth of a Black family was $11,000. Obviously, we're dealing with factors of difference. The inequity we see is a result of legislative choices made. And so the question is, where do Christians fit into this? If Christians can be involved in the public square, as the U.S. Constitution allows, what did they do? A starting point for thinking about that is to look at how African American leaders, clergy, were at the forefront of addressing the crisis of conscience that segregation presented to the United States. So a good point of departure here is to look at Howard Thurman, who was perhaps the leading intellectual figure in the mid-20th century within the Black church. He is the dean of chapel at Howard University and then later at Boston University. Martin Luther King Jr., when he is a doctoral student at Boston University, is there when Howard Thurman is the dean of chapel. And so we have good evidence for their interactions in that context. What Thurman does is he brings the African-American civil rights movement into conversation with global international movements for self-determination. Crucially, Howard Thurman travels to India in the 1940s and interacts with Mahatma Gandhi as Gandhi is leading the movement for Indian self-dependence, for Indian nationalism. And he draws from Gandhi this idea of non-violent direct action as the key strategy for the civil rights movement. That is non-violent civil disobedience grounded within a moral framework. For Gandhi, that was a set of Hindu teachings. For Thurman, that's going to be grounded in a set of Christian/biblical teachings. That non-violent civil disobedience within a moral framework is used to undermine the racist assertions of white supremacy. Often racist assertions of white supremacy that are supported theologically by parts of the white church. And so really part of what the civil rights movement is the encounter of the black church with parts of the white church and them trying to speak to each other about which hold the true interpretations of Jesus Christ in how they understand who the human person is and what a just society looks like. Obviously the paragon for this encounter is Martin Luther King Jr., who perhaps is well known to all of you, but just a few highlights of his career to name. In 1954, he becomes pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He's quite young. He, at that point in time, just in his early 30s. The next year, he organizes a bus boycott, which results in a Supreme Court issuing an order for the bus system in Montgomery to be integrated. Of course, the leadership of Rosa Parks is also important in that narrative. He begins to lead civil rights movements. He receives the Nobel Peace Prize. He develops the March on Washington. He is instrumental in the Civil Rights Act being passed. And he is assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel. Perhaps his fundamental document for really understanding his theology and his critique of white Christianity, not just the overtly racist white Christianity, but the moderate, let's not cause too many ripples white Christianity, is his letter from a Birmingham jail, composed in 1963. This is written in response to clergy, leading clergy from the state of Alabama, who write a call to unity that's published in the major newspapers in Alabama that criticize the protests that King is leading in Birmingham. And if you recall, there is significant violence unleashed on protesters by the Alabama police, or the Birmingham police in particular. The images of fire hoses being used on children, police dogs. And what the leaders of the churches say is it's actually King who is causing these problems because the protests he's leading are unwise and untimely. And these leaders wish that King would go slower, would not encourage his sit-ins and other kinds of nonviolent protests that provoke this reaction, as they claim. It's important to name that we are talking here about the Roman Catholic bishop for Alabama. We're talking about the bishop of the United Methodist Church Conference in Alabama, the chief moderator of the General Synod for the Presbyterian Church in Alabama, and of course the bishop and the bishop coadjutor for the Diocese of Alabama of the Episcopal Church. So these are the leading voices, and these voices are not supporting the maintenance of segregation. They want integration to happen, but they want to have it happen moderately, with all due, caution. They don't want disruption to happen. And so they're saying it's going to take longer than you want, Dr. King, for these events to unfold. And please leave the state and let us take care of this because we know how to change this better than you do. And so King responds in this letter from a Birmingham jail, really talking about the fundamental issues at play here. And really, what is the highest Christian value at stake? Is it unity or is it justice? The white clergy leaders focus on the need for unity. King will speak about the pressing need for justice. So he argues that justice is the grounding for morality. And he uses here a concept of interrelation, that everyone is, as he says, an inescapable network of mutuality. And so he says famously, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I am impacted by what happens to my neighbor. He argues that's a fundamental teaching of Christianity. And he says, it's correct. These nonviolent direct actions are causing a crisis in this community. But the purpose is to cause a crisis in a racist leadership system like that's entrenched in the city of Birmingham, because prior to this point, the powers that be have refused to negotiate and have denied the inherent justice that ought to be the due of African American citizens of the city of Birmingham. And so King notices that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. There needs to be a crisis that causes the ground to move. And so really the question then is whether or not the law itself is just. Part of the white moderate argument is that if a law is on the books that's discriminatory, but it's not causing any actual physical harm, it ought to be obeyed until the proper authorities change it. So King really wants to confront this argument. So if we have our book American Religions by Marie Griffith, we can turn to page 506, letter from Birmingham City Jail, where he talks about this issue of breaking laws that the leaders are so concerned about. He writes in the middle of the page, "You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. But one may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and there are unjust laws." And King goes on, "I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all." Now, what's the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that's out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And so all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the person. Indeed, the problem is that segregation gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. So not what he does here with his mostly Christian interlocutors. He goes right to the tradition. And he cites both Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. Now what's really remarkable, I think, is that King is writing this in jail. He doesn't have all his books in front of us, but he's quoting from memory. And I'm sure he's written on this issue elsewhere. So he's practiced this argument. But he's able to draw from his learning to deal with the question of segregation from the stance of the Christian tradition itself. And it's important what he's saying here is that this fundamental issue of justice relates to the human person in themselves. And who are they created to be? And the problem with segregation is it distorts everyone in the system. It is a manifestation of sin that harms both the perpetrator and the victim. And so it must be done away with for the good of all. What he's trying to do here is actually argue that white folks will not lose anything when segregation ends. The great white fear is somehow losing their status if integration happens. And it's really important to examine that fear of loss of status. So I think that is still an issue that permeates certain sectors of America even today when we think about issues of racial justice and equity. So King's writing here can be very instructive. Moreover, King develops a critique of the white church, so to speak, in this letter, where he notes that some oppose the civil rights movement just explicitly. They say, we just don't want this, we won't have it, like Governor Wallace of Alabama. While others are cautious about it or silent in favor of the status quo. Indeed, King writes that his greatest disappointment is with the white Christian moderate. It's much easier, he says, for me to deal with the out-and-out racist segregationist. So at least I know where they stand. But the white Christian moderate, who doesn't really want to stand for justice, doesn't really want the system to change, but just wishes the whole problem would go away. That is who he critiques the most. So he says, it's the white Christian moderate, people who think they're just good folk because they show up to church, are the ones who really need to recapture this prophetic spirit of sacrifice for the sake of justice. Another way of framing that is, does the white Christian moderate really love their neighbor? Or perhaps they will just pass their neighbor on the side of the road. We know the general trajectory of the civil rights movement. That it does lead to the end of discriminatory law. That there are substantial gains made in all realms of American society. And significant problems remain. And significant resistance to full integration is manifested beginning in the 1950s, and we can argue still manifests today. And it's important to look at how the civil rights movement, much of the resistance to it was led by explicitly conservative white Christians. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention, led by W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, denounces integration when the Brown versus Board of Education decision is rendered in 1956. And he really mobilizes other white conservative Protestant Christians to engage in resistance to education as much as they can. And this is the significant moment where the political religious right begins to emerge. And the shift of Southern politics from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. As the Democratic Party, through a coalition that's mostly based in the North and in the West, realigns in favor of civil rights, there's a large movement away from them to the Republican Party in the South, where the Democratic Party had been largely a segregationist party up until this period of time that we're talking about. This is also the moment of the rise of private Christian schools and the creation of voucher programs as a response to school integration. You will notice that in many parts of the country, Christian schools, if you look at their founding date, their founding is right around this time period, the Brown versus Board of Education decision. In some southern states, white families simply stop sending their children to school rather than have them go to integrated schools until they can get private schools or voucher programs set up. The state of Mississippi doesn't even have public school for a full year, rather than have white and black children go to school together. Why? Again, it seems to be rooted in this white anxiety about losing cultural supremacy, about losing status, even when that isn't the goal of the civil rights movement. But there is an us versus them mentality that's baked in here on the segregationist side. And that anxiety about losing cultural supremacy is translated into the language of religious liberty that still exists with us today. So religious liberty here is really code for continuing to perpetuate segregation in educational and other institutional structures. So now we see really clear links emerging between white Christianity, white nationalism, and white supremacy. This has always been a part of a troubling legacy of American religious history, and we can see a particular trajectory for that developing here in the context of the civil rights movement. This is all to say that we need to look at the civil rights movement from a Christian lens as being a very complex movement with different Christian actors engaged in different strategies for approaching the question, different sense of assumptions about what the desired outcome is, and different frameworks for addressing how to achieve that outcome. I hope this gives you a lot to think about. I look forward to talking more about this in class. In the next video, we're going to be thinking about other manifestations of civil rights movements within the context of American religion.